Hello everybody. So this is the second part of this set of lectures devoted to the study of topological order. In the set of these 4 lectures, I'm going to discuss several aspects of the quantum Hall effect, covering both the integer case and the fractional case. The materials in which these quantum Hall effects will be reviewed include historically the first interesting ones that appeared in 2-dimensional electron gases in gallium arsenide or silicon and a few other candidates. And then in more recent times, this quantum Hall physics has been renewed by studies made in graphene and graphene-derived materials. So I will discuss also the case of monolayer graphene as well as bilayer graphene. So first of all, I would like to present you a little bit why there is a rich interplay between fundamental physics. For example, the study of fractional statistics or fractional charge certainly has to do with the most basic aspect of physical science. But there is also a technological aspect in the studies of the 2-dimensional electron gases, which is very important. For example, you see this very basic cell phone on which I have an app which is able to tell me the power level of the radio waves it's able to detect. And I see that right now in this room, my cell phone provider is able to deliver a signal whose typical power level is of the order of the femtowatt. And femtowatt, so 10 to the minus 15 watts, that's something which is very impressive. And that's something which is absolutely necessary for the present technology. If you want cell phones that are fitting in your pockets, then you need very low noise amplifiers. And this was a very long struggle, the fact of creating semiconductor devices able to amplify very weak radio signals. And the key to do that, the key to create such transistors, this I will discuss in some detail. So the main industrial reason for the study of 2-dimensional electron gases is that you can make very low noise transistors called high electronic mobility transistors. And so this was something that was successfully started in the 70s, both in Fujitsu company in Japan and also in the LCR lab of Thomson very close to here, where people decided to create artificially complex sandwiches of semiconductors. Let me show you, oops, no, not yet, an example of this. And they were able to use this to make very sensitive radio receivers. And in the 80s, for example, one success of using very low noise receivers based on these high electronic mobility transistors was the success of the Voyager mission to the outer planets. So at the end of the 80s, there were 2 space probes that were able to send data, including nice pictures of Uranus and Neptune, Voyager 1 and 2. And you have to realize that the signals were sent from essentially 1 billion kilometers away with an antenna with a size which is of the order of 4 meters, and the power of the transmitters on board these probes was something like 20 watts. So on the Earth, you have also an antenna which may be much bigger. In fact, the diameter is of the order of 70 meters. And this leads to a received power, so right at the focus of this Cassegrain style antenna, this leads to a power which is of the order of the attowatt. So while I said that now commercially we are able to detect femtowatt, then you needed femtowatt level. So femtowatt, FW, attowatt level. So 10 to the 18. That was the typical sensitivity of these receivers that were realized at this time using high electronic mobility transistors. And this is something which is now pretty current technology. So there was clearly a technological advance that was motivated by, let's say, practical purposes. And in parallel, this has led to the development of the rich physics of the quantum Hall effect. So these are typical integration of high electronic mobility transistors in integrated circuits now that are common. This is essentially the type of components that are present in cell phones. So essentially, the first transistor, when you follow the antenna of your cell phone, the first transistor right in contact with the antenna is a high electronic mobility transistor based on the two-dimensional electronic gas. So the way you create that is that you have a piling up of several different semiconductors, like gallium arsenide and aluminum gallium arsenide, and then you have formation of two-dimensional gas of electrons at the interface between different semiconductors. So there are several ways to do that. You may be in the case of a quantum well which confines the 2D electron gas, where the quantum well is along the z direction, so let's say the direction perpendicular to the plane. Or it may be that the electron gas is residing at an interface in which there is a discontinuity in the electrostatic potential, so that it's essentially located in a triangular potential well. So this is what is called an heterojunction. In this case, what means two-dimensional? It means simply that the motion along the z direction, it's essentially restricted to be the ground state wave function of the electronic problem along the z direction. So while the electrons are free to move on the plane, then in the z direction, their motion it's essentially blocked because they are just occupying the lowest energy state of the quantum well or of the triangular potential. So that's what we mean by 2D in such electron gases. When we discuss graphene, monolayer or bilayer graphene, then this is something, the confinement is completely different. It's really due to the atomic structure of the material. While here it's something which is done on purpose with a special piling up of materials. So why would you do something which is so complex to realize? And the idea essentially is as follows. In usual semiconductors, the transistor physics is based on the idea of the p-n junction. And to create a p-n junction, you have to do some doping of the semiconductor. And in the first realizations of doping, then you put dopants precisely where the electrons are moving. So it's bulk doping. You have a 3D material. You have defects that are giving rise to p-type or n-type charge carriers. So certainly you have carriers, but they are moving inside the defects, which means that there is a lot of scattering, and it's not good for the transistor quality. While in the 70s, people had the brilliant idea of create what is called remote doping. So the strategy is that you put the dopants somewhere, and you create a structure so that the electrons prefer to leave the dopants and go somewhere else. So in such structures, in fact, the dopants are not located where is the 2D electron gas. So that the electrons are free to move in a place where there are no impurities. So no defects on which to scatter, or let's say very few defects. So that's a way to obtain electron gases with excellent electronic transport properties. let me briefly discuss this important property, because after all, this is the main reason why improvement of this quantity led to samples in which we could discover the quantum Hall effect. So it's convenient to define what we call the mobility of the electron gas. If you apply an electric field onto the electron gas, then electron will drift following the electric field, and they will reach some limiting velocity that will be proportional to the applied field. And the proportionality constant, this is called the mobility of the electron gas. So it's a reflection of the fact that you are not accelerating freely all the time, but there is a limiting velocity. So there is, which is due to scattering on defects or whatever. So this mobility, it's really a measure of the quality of the sample. So that's a complicated plot in which you see the mobility as a function of temperature and time. So just briefly about the temperature dependence. When the temperature is low enough, then you no longer scatter onto phonons that are thermally excited modes, but you just scatter on residual impurities that are essentially static. So that's the best you can do at very low temperatures, and you see that the mobility are reaching plateaus as a function of the temperature. But with time and better sample fabrication, then these plateaus are rising and rising. So rising the value of the mobility is nice if you want to sell transistors, but it's also very nice if you want to discover new physics. And essentially, it's the achievement of mobility around these values in these units, it doesn't really matter. But then that was essentially the time of the discovery of the integer quantum Hall effect. And then gaining essentially one order of magnitude in mobility led to the discovery of the fractional quantum Hall effect. So that's why the progress of technology, of basic technology, has led to the possible discovery of complex many-body physics that was otherwise buried in the effects of disorder. So now let me discuss this quantum Hall effect. After all, I mentioned that twice, I mean in the integer and fractional case, but let's first review the basic classical Hall effect. So you have a piece of material in which there is a current flowing due to the presence of a generator, that's the current I. You apply a magnetic field which is perpendicular to the plane where the electrons are moving, and then you measure the voltage across what we'll call the Hall bar. So that's the Hall voltage, okay? That's, of course, a very basic scheme. In a more realistic sample, so we have the sample with the electron gas, that's this rectangle. The current is driven through these two contacts, and you can measure the Hall voltage across the bar by looking at these two dots, for example. And if you have more dots, you can also measure the voltage drop when the current is flowing along the bar. Across the bar, that's the Hall voltage. And then along the bar, we will have a longitudinal voltage drop. Okay? So that's the quantity we will measure. So what we call the Hall resistance, that's the ratio of this voltage divided by this intensity. Okay? So you can do a very simple calculation in a classical model like the Drude model of conduction to compute the Hall voltage and obtain what we call the Hall resistance, ratio of Hall voltage divided by intensity, and you find that it's very simple. It's proportional to the magnetic field divided by the two-dimensional density times the charge of the charge carriers. So you should realize that, so the basic physical phenomena which is captured by this simple formula, it's simply that when electrons are going along the bar, they feel the Lorentz force, which pushes you into cyclotron orbits. So electrons are deflected towards one side of the sample. So there is a charge imbalance across the bar, which means that there is a voltage that appears. And this is not a dissipative phenomena, okay? It's just due to the Lorentz force. The Lorentz force is always perpendicular to the velocity, so it doesn't do any work. There is no energy injection in the system by the Lorentz force. It's a non-dissipative phenomena, which is something which is a little bit hidden when we define the resistance, because it has the dimension of an electric resistance, because it's a voltage divided by an intensity, but it's not a dissipative phenomenon. So now in this very simple formula, you see that, of course, one can measure three things. You can measure the magnetic field, provided you know density and charge, okay? Or you can measure the density, and that's the way which is probably the most common used in semiconductor labs in general. That's the way to measure the number of charge carriers in your samples. And then, of course, you can measure Q. You can say that this is not really important, but in fact, you should realize that that's the way people discovered some quantum mechanical phenomenon, which is very important in the physics of solid state, is that in some materials, it's not electrons that do carry the electric charge, but it's holes, which means that there is a minus sign with respect to what you would expect from electrons. And that was the direct proof that you may have electric conduction due to holes, which is something you understand only when you have quantum mechanics. When you have a Fermi sea, so imposed by the Pauli principle, and then you make holes in it. So that's why this formula may lead to important discoveries. Okay, does it work? Yes, it works. And that's the original measurement by Mr. Hall himself, where you see that this is the Hall resistance as a function of the magnetic field, and then it's linear in B, as expected. There are few points, and the magnetic field is not that large, and that's certainly convincing. That's not a 2D electron gas, by the way. It's, of course, a 3D material. But, of course, you can do also Hall measurements with 3D materials. Okay, so now let's go forward to the modern era, beginning of the 80s, and let's do such measurements. So on the horizontal axis, you have the magnetic field applied to some two-dimensional electronic gas with a large enough mobility. And then there are two axes. You see that the red points, the red curves correspond precisely to the resistance, the Hall resistance, which is called rho xy because it has to do with two perpendicular directions, while the blue curve corresponds to the longitudinal resistance, which is the resistance you compute by dividing the voltage along the bar divided by the intensity. So when the magnetic field is weak enough, then you see that the red curve has a linear part. That's exactly like in the experiment of Mr. Hall. And you see that the longitudinal resistance has some non-zero value, which is in the beginning weakly dependent of the magnetic field, as you would expect from some ordinary conducting material, some non-zero resistance. But then in this sample, you discover some very striking deviations from the classical Hall phenomenology. So that's made, so it's a 2D gas at very low temperature and a very good mobility. So you see two novelties, essentially. The first one is that in the Hall resistance, there are plateaus that appear. So there is a very clear staircase of plateaus. And then in the longitudinal resistance, you see that now the resistance goes essentially to zero. It cannot be measured in the sense, it means really that there is no voltage drop along the bar. if you measure the voltage drop along the bar, then it's no longer measurable. And when this resistance goes to 0, then you are right in a plateau of the whole resistance. So there is a relationship between the two, because when you are in a region where the longitudinal resistance goes to 0, which means that there is no voltage drop along the bar, it means that measuring the whole voltage can be done for any points along the sample, because there is no voltage drop along the direction of the current. So the value that you measure will be the same as soon as your two probes are on opposite sides of the sample. But it doesn't matter where they are. While, of course, it's not the case when you are not in a regime where this resistance is no longer 0. So there is no voltage drop, there are plateaus, and then there is also something which is absolutely striking, is that the values of the whole resistance, it's 1 over an integer times h divided by the square of the electric charge. So it's easy to check that h divided by e squared as the dimension of a resistance. It's of the order of 26 kilo ohm. And if you look at the prefactor, so we define the whole conductance, which is the inverse, then it's perfectly quantized into integers. So this quantity is an integer to an exceedingly great precision. So this phenomenon is called the integer quantum Hall effect. Okay? So that's a very big deviation from the classical behavior. And to understand this effect, I will argue that we need quantum mechanics. So we will need to do quantum mechanics of electrons moving on a plane with a perpendicular magnetic field. Another ingredient which is important is the presence of disorder. Even though I argue that disorder is something that should be reduced so that you can access to this regime, in fact, the mere existence of extended plateaus has to do with the presence of disorder. Yes, Ricardo.
In principle, I mean, if you have an ideal sample, do you have an infinite number of plateaus, or you know that the plateau stops somewhere? You have, I mean, there is 8, so I have 10, 12, whatever. It goes.
Normally,
depends on the sample.
It's sample dependent. It has to do with the disorder. If you have better and better samples, you should see more and more plateaus.
Okay.
Absolutely. So in this first part, we will treat the quantum mechanics of one electron in a plane with a perpendicular magnetic field. Then I will discuss a physical picture of what happens with disorder, and I will claim that this explains essentially the basic physical phenomenology of the integer quantum Hall effect. In this case, you do not really need to invoke interactions between electrons, although they are, of course, here. There's no reason why they would vanish in this case. And nevertheless, they are present even in the integer quantum Hall effect. Then later, when we discuss the fractional case, we'll see that they are really at center stage, and we cannot get any non-interacting picture that works in a simple way. Okay, so let's try to make a simple model of electrons moving on a plane with magnetic field. So the first fact is that when you have 2D electrons and you apply a perpendicular magnetic field, then there is formation of what are called the Landau levels. So this is a very striking quantum phenomenon, in the sense that instead of having a continuous set of energy eigenvalues, then the kinetic energy is quantized and takes only discrete values. So these discrete values are governed by the cyclotron frequency. So that's the classical frequency of cyclotron motion, EB divided by m. And times h bar, it gives you an energy, and that's the energy of the splittings between these levels. So we will consider the following model. So an electron moving freely in a 2D plane under the influence of a vector potential that corresponds to a magnetic field which is uniform and perpendicular to the plane. And this is the effective mass corresponding to the electrons of the semiconductor that are moving in this plane. It's not the free electron mass. You should realize that these electrons are coming from an impurity band, in fact from the bottom of an impurity band, and you are making a quadratic approximation to the bottom of the band, and that's in fact what means that we are looking at this simple kinetic energy. In the case of gallium arsenide, for example, so popular in transistors, this m star is something like 0.067 times the free mass of the electron. So the kinetic energy is completely frozen in the presence of the magnetic field. We will see how. And then the electrons occupy the Landau levels whose energy are given by h bar omega c times an integer plus 1/2, where this integer takes only positive values. Now, to accommodate all the quantum states that we know that are here in the absence of the magnetic field, it means that these Landau levels are degenerate. And there is a degeneracy which is proportional to the area of the system. So we will make the calculation in detail. But you see, it means that going to the limit of zero field, in fact, it's something a bit tricky, because if we completely remove the magnetic field and look at 2D electrons with the parabolic dispersion, then the density of state is constant, okay, and extends up to infinity formally. While as soon as there is a non-zero magnetic field, you just get this set of discrete levels. So if you are a bit formal, you would say that the density of states, it's a sum of delta functions located on each Landau level. And these Landau levels, they do have a degeneracy which is proportional to the area of the system, so which is in fact very large. So when you send the magnetic field to zero, then all these delta functions are collapsing together to create a function which is constant. So that's, of course, the ideal limit. But of course, you see that things are certainly a bit complicated in the limit when B goes to zero. For larger values of the magnetic field, what happens is that the separation between the levels is growing with B, and these levels are more and more degenerate. So now you can guess more or less what happens when you put free electrons. We ignore spin so far. So we have a bunch of electrons. We put them into these orbitals, and we look at very low temperatures where we expect to find these electrons in the ground state of the system. So you will fill all levels till the Fermi level. And what will happen? Imagine that we fill completely, for example, the first 3 levels. Okay? So that the Fermi level is somewhere here in this gap. If you increase the magnetic field, these gaps will increase, but there will be more and more levels available on each Landau level, so that at some point you will start to put the electrons of the third into the extra levels available in the second Landau level when B is increasing. So for intermediate values of B, you will have partial filling of this level, and this one will be completely filled. And then for large enough B, then there will be no remaining electrons in the third, and everybody will fill the Landau levels, the second and the first. And then finally, if the field is large enough, everybody will be in this Landau level. So that's the simple free electron band filling picture. So you see that certainly we can expect that there will be closed shell effects, because there are obviously special situations when there is when you are filling an exact integer number of Landau levels. And then when the magnetic field is large enough, you are just filling some states of the lowest Landau level. And then it means that something different will happen. So let me make a small picture of the density of states. So D as a function of the energy. So that's the energy. Okay, I will draw the density on a perpendicular axis. Oh, sorry. So in the ideal situation, I have Landau levels, discrete Landau levels separated by h bar omega c. And that's it, okay? And of course, this is a very, very idealized model in which there is perfect translation invariance on the plane. The field is completely homogeneous. There is no spin whatever. So of course, you guess that this situation, this ideal situation, will be perturbed by many phenomena. So the simplest deviation from this ideal model, you can guess that these levels will be enlarged. There's no reason for this degeneracy to be exact. Nevertheless, if perturbations are weak, then they will become peaks in the density of states for many, many reasons. So you see that there will be regions with very small density of states and regions right in the middle of the band with a very large density of states. So now if you measure any physical quantity which has to do with the density of states at the Fermi level, like the resistance, electric resistance, magnetic susceptibility, then you guess immediately that when you vary the magnetic field, you will see oscillatory phenomenon because the density of state is oscillating. Imagine that there are many, many levels and the field is quite slow, is quite low. You vary it, then everything should oscillate. This was known well before the integer effect. Resistivity oscillations are called Shubnikov-de Haas oscillations. And the oscillations of the magnetic susceptibility are called de Haas-Van Alphen oscillations. And these are very basic and well-known phenomena of solid state. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
What fixes the size of the density, the spread of the density?
The spread of the density has to do with the strength of the disorder.
Strength of the disorder.
Okay. For very small disorder, we expect that this density of state should be extremely low, and we should be very close to the ideal delta function situation. So certainly, having oscillations as a function of B, that's fine. So that's the low field regime that you see before the vanishing of the longitudinal resistance. There are oscillations of the resistivity. So these are called Shubnikov-de Haas, and that's certainly something we can expect on naive grounds. Okay, so now let me do the quantum mechanical exercise of deriving these Landau levels explicitly. So we have this simple Hamiltonian. This vector potential so gives rise to a uniform magnetic field applied to the system. I will first give you a derivation of these Landau levels without taking a special gauge. It's possible to make a few calculations before any gauge choice. So let me define pi, which is plus EA. These two quantities, they do not commute, so there is pi x, pi y. And if you compute the commutator, you will find that this is minus E b times h bar. And from this calculation, you can define, you see that it's natural to define a magnetic length, what we will call the magnetic length, small l, which is square root of h bar over EB. So that's homogeneous to a length, and it's just defined by the presence of the magnetic field. In physical units, it's 25 nanometers divided by square root of B in Tesla. So for any reasonable values of the magnetic field, you see that it will be, in general, much larger than the atomic lattice spacing. So the quantum Hall physics will be governed by phenomenon that happens at a physics which is not the microscopic lattice spacing physics. Okay, so we have pi x, pi y that do not commute. And you see that then, as we know from the usual harmonic oscillator problem, we can define lowering and raising operators from this pi x, pi y. So let me define a dagger, which is L over square root of 2 pi x plus I pi y. Pi x, pi y are Hermitian operators, so this A dagger has an Hermitian conjugate A, and it is built so that the commutator A dagger is exactly unity. Units are removed by the definition of this L. Okay. Right? And so the magic of this guy, of this A operator, is that if now I rewrite the Hamiltonian, I can write it as h bar omega c times A dagger plus 1/2. So you see that this harmonic oscillator gives rise to a ladder of states that are spaced by exactly the same quantity h bar omega c. So this explains the value of the energy, of the energies. But of course, you see that this is not the full solution of the quantum mechanical problem, because we are dealing with 4 degrees of freedom, x, y, px, py. Okay. While so far we have just constructed one harmonic oscillator with A and A dagger. So there should be another harmonic oscillator. So to construct this other guy, let me define x and y, capital X, capital Y, given by x minus L squared over h bar by y, right, y plus L squared over h bar by x. These two combinations of the impulsion of position would appear in the classical in the solution of the classical equations of motion. They correspond to the motion of the guiding center of the cyclotron orbit. When you solve the problem of a particle moving in a magnetic field, you find a cyclotron motion, but of course, the circles that are described, they do have a center. These are the coordinates of this center. If you compute now the commutator of these two quantities, x and y, you find that this is IL squared, and they have the dimension of a length, of course. So that's exactly what you need to introduce another harmonic oscillator. So let me call B, which is 1 over L square root of 2 x plus IY. So there is, of course, then a B dagger. And that's a set of operators that will give rise also to the possibility of creating eigenstates. But all the eigenstates we will create by acting on the vacuum with B dagger, they will correspond to the same energy. Because it's easy to check that B and B dagger, they commute with the Hamiltonian, which in fact means that A and B, they do commute for all combinations. It's an independent harmonic oscillator, okay? And what this second harmonic oscillator is doing is that it's creating the set of degenerate states. So while the AA dagger corresponds to cyclotron excitations, then B dagger leads to you are moving in the manifold of states that have the same energy. So all eigenstates may be reached by acting with A dagger and B dagger onto the vacuum, like this, with n and m positive integers. So I will just write it on a unnormalized manner, okay? So this is something which is general and gauge independent. So let me now give you formulas for two gauges we will use in the remainder of these lectures. So the first one we will use is the Landau gauge. So in the Landau gauge, you decide that, let me check which Landau gauge I will use, okay. So you decide that AX is 0 and AY it's B times X, which means that if you look at the kinetic energy, it's Px squared over 2m star plus 1 over 2m star Py plus EBx. Since the Hamiltonian doesn't depend upon the y coordinate, you can decide that the y dependence is a plane wave. So I can look for eigenstates as a plane wave along y times a function of x. And for this function phi, you see that it will be governed by a very simple Hamiltonian. So Py it's h bar over I d dy. So this is h bar k plus EBx squared. This will act upon phi with eigenvalues epsilon. Okay? But then, okay, that's an harmonic oscillator along the x direction whose center is shifted by k. And then you know the solutions, okay? It means that there will be an integer small n, positive of 0, And then you can take the complete wave function will be given by this plane wave times the eigenvalues of the harmonic oscillators centered on this k-dependent quantity. So phi n will be the nth excited state of the harmonic oscillator along x, and function so of x plus k, and you recognize that it's L squared, the combination which appears, where L is the magnetic length, and that you see appearing. Factoring EB, then you reconstruct L squared, and the associated energy En is then simply h bar omega c times n plus 1/2, where these are the eigenfunctions of the harmonic oscillator. So we know them, of course. So psi n, it's plane wave along y, a Gaussian, that's the harmonic oscillator Gaussian, centered on this k-dependent quantity, times a Hermite polynomial of order n, and divided by L if I want to be homogeneous. It doesn't matter really. So these are the eigenstates of the 2D Landau problem in the Landau gauge. Let me draw a box around this nice formula. So we can even make some drawing of them. Let's look at what is the lowest Landau level. So the lowest Landau level, it's given by the minimal cyclotron excitation. So this is n equals 0, okay? N equals 0, so there is no Hermite polynomial. Oops. So there is no Hermite polynomial, and as a function of x, it's just a Gaussian, which is located at minus kl squared. So in the Landau gauge, you have a plane wave. So this is, let's say, this is y. And then in x direction, you have a Gaussian, which is centered on minus kl squared. And that's the shape of the wave functions, okay? By solving this problem, then you see that we found the ladder of energies, okay? That's simply the excitations of the harmonic oscillator. But then the remaining question is, but where is the degeneracy? Okay, after all, we said that we can describe all eigenstates by using these two harmonic oscillators, okay? Okay. So, is it time to make a break, you mean? No? No, not yet.
Yes.
Okay, so we have the energies of the eigenproblem, then we have to find the degeneracy. After all, we claim that you can move inside a given Landau level by acting with this mysterious B operator. So where is B? You don't see it in what I wrote, but then you have to realize that you have to use the boundaries of the sample, because, as I said, Landau level degeneracy has to do with the area of the sample. Okay. So imagine that your sample has a dimension Lx times Ly. As a function of Ly, you see that imposing periodic boundary conditions on y means that you should have quantization of k. K should be 2 pi over Ly times an integer n. So there is quantization of k, okay? But then now you see that as a function of k, the wave packet which is described by this wave function, it's moving in x space. So to find a number of allowed state, we will require that the values of x are constrained to live in an interval of length Ly, of Lx, sorry. Okay? So I want the location of the wave packet to be inside an interval of length Lx. So k L squared should be in this range. It's not a completely, of course, it's not a completely consistent discussion because this argument, it's a bit fuzzy on the edges, okay? Because I'm not really imposing periodic boundary conditions on X. It can be done, but it's technically much more complicated. So let's just do the dirty argument and obtain the correct result. Because anyway, we know that for large enough area, it should be certainly correct. So K should be bounded by this interval, which means that the integer that should appear in the quantized value of K should satisfy this bound, which means that the integer range has an upper bound which is then equal to Lx Ly divided by 2 pi L squared, which is dimensionless as it should be. So the integer part of this quantity should be the bound on K, which means that that's the total number of quantum states available in a given Landau level. And it's independent on which Landau level you look at. You just change, you add the Hermite polynomial that will give you oscillations instead of simply a Gaussian, but it doesn't matter very much. So that's fine. That's the Landau level degeneracy. If now you use the formula we have for the magnetic length, just on the other blackboard, you see that this is equal to EB over H times Lx Ly, which is the area of the sample. B times the area, this is the flux through the sample. And H divided by E, this is something which is homogeneous to a flux. And this is called the flux quantum for obvious reasons. It has exactly the right physical dimension. And it is certainly quantum since there is H in it. So that's the flux divided by the elementary flux quantum, phi naught. And this number, it's precisely the Landau level degeneracy. So you see that, as advertised, when you increase B, then there are more and more levels available. And that will be proportional to the area. For any macroscopic sample, of course, it will be a huge number of available states. Because it's the elementary area has to do, of course, with L squared, whose value you have in physical units above. So it's nevertheless a small quantity. So there are many quantum states available. Okay, I will make the break now. And then we will discuss the consequence of these Landau orbitals onto the transport properties of the system. Thank you.